And like I said, ultimately that can save a patient's life. And the families also feel much more positive, even when it might not be the absolute best outcome. It still feels much better than it could have been had you put the patient on defense by automatically just going, no, we can't do that. And then they don't feel heard or respected or any of those things. And
your business's success depends on relationships, relationships with the customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Karl Pontau. Each week, I'll bring you stories, insights, and practical advice from experts that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week, I'm connecting with Jesse Shternshus. Jesse believes that investing in professional development is the key to unlocking our best selves. That's why she works with clients to engage inclusive and interactive environments that inspire growth and encourage new ways of thinking. Curious to know what she's done? Here are some highlights. She has a proven track record of success, having been a key player in working with leaders and teams from global companies and organizations such as the United Nations, the Mayo Clinic, Ocean Spray, Macy's, Mural, Walgreens, Capital One, TransferWise, and Cliff Bar. She is also a co-author of Control Shift, 50 Games for 50 Days Like Today, and No More Meetings, the co-creator of the card game Together to Gather, and a keynote speaker at conferences and Fortune 500 companies worldwide. Congrats on your track record of success, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
thanks so much, Karl. Thanks for having me.
So I love the name of your company, the Improv Effect. And so how does improv and storytelling lead to new ways of thinking, which I think is so important these days as companies deal with all the changes going on?
Yeah, so I think improv as its fundamentals, where it's all grounded in, really helps you be able to think on the fly. It helps you be able to redirect the way you're thinking and reframe, but it also is all about bringing lots of different perspectives to the table, and so that everybody's voice belongs, and ultimately that helps with new ways of thinking, right? If it was only one voice and it was like stand-up comedy, you would only be hearing one perspective. But when you're working as a team and bringing lots of people together and fundamentally learning how to be present and actively listening, you're then learning how to hear lots of different perspectives and learning how change can ultimately work when you're seeing how other people think.
Yeah, I know from my understanding of improv that there's the whole idea of just yes and as the core part of it, where you're not shutting down ideas, you're incorporating them in. And it seems like a lot of businesses currently are don't operate on that model. There's this very much like a lot of gatekeeping and shutting down of ideas that leads to cultures where people aren't even willing to voice an idea that might be a game changer because they're so used to being told no. And leaders that use improv and are able to be open to those new ideas from other people on their teams are going to have a huge advantage going forward, because it doesn't matter where the great idea comes from. If it's a great idea that moves your company forward, then why would you shut it down? Someone from like the mailroom who comes up with something great, like why would you not listen to that if it's just because of who it's coming from, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's really about having that mindset and creating a culture of validating people's ideas and bringing everybody into the fold. It's about making sure that the other person feels heard and respected. And then on top of that, building together so that the yes and is two parts, right? It's the validity and saying, yes, I'm in agreement with what you've said in terms of let's explore it. And then the and is let's explore it together so that we both have ownership, or all of us have ownership in where this is going to go. And so it really takes down people's defenses. And it also leaves tons of room for exploration that can ultimately lead to really exciting and new innovative ideas.
I can totally see how that work. And I imagine based on your bio, you've had some great examples and experiences of this in action. Could you have a particular case story in mind you could share of when this really kicked off?
I think, I mean, there's all sorts of examples of where it works. And I think the best examples are where the room just completely changes feeling, right? So you go from a room that may have distrust in each other to the room just all of a sudden laughing and smiling, and it's just the trust has completely transformed the way people work together, right? I can give you little examples of things that then have enormous outcomes. And one, for instance, is Mayo Clinic. They use the idea of yes and all the time, right? And so when they go in and they're working with the patients, right? So doctors or nurses are working with patients, they incorporate yes and so that their patients are part of their team, right? And they're coming up with solutions, whether innovative or not. They're saving patients' lives. They're helping the family's outcome feel much better at the end. And it's because they're incorporating that idea of yes and it's what does the patient and the patient's family have to say? And then how can we incorporate that into the routine, into the patient's care? So ultimately, we come out with a much better outcome for everyone, right? And ultimately, that can really save a patient's life, right?
Yeah, I know there's a big problem of people, like patients don't like take the meds they've been prescribed, but they don't follow along with what the doctor is recommending. And I think it's kind of like the IKEA effect, where if people help build the recommendations and have that contribution, then they feel like they own it and they care about it more, and the more likely to actually do what
Right.
needs to be done instead of having being like imposed on them. It's like, oh,
Correct.
I got to contribute to the solution.
The solution and the story.
Yeah.
And when they're a part of the solution and the story, and it's being built together, one layer and one brick at a time, often the outcome is much, much more positive. And like I said, ultimately that can save a patient's life. And the families also feel much more positive, even when it might not be the absolute best outcome. It still feels much better than it could have been had you put the patient on defense by automatically just going, no, we can't do that. And then they don't feel heard or respected or any of those things. And I know we've all been in situations where we've been in medical, care where we don't feel heard or listened to. And that just doesn't feel good at all, right? So I think that's a really good, important example.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's something that when you first work with that sort of client, that there's a lot that might be trying to suggest that that's something that can actually improve patient care. When you think about like what the audience in that case, these medical professionals and physicians and stuff that are so experts in like what they do, and there's a lot of can be a lot of egos or just a lot of like
Yes.
like they went to school, they've all this expertise, they know what's going on. And so I'd imagine that's a more or potentially more prevalent hurdle to getting people to accept the whole improv yes and mentality. But I imagine that also though, if you can get it to work for something like Mayo Clinic, then it can work in a boardroom as well as the doctor's office.
Yeah, I think once they realize the effect it can have, then the defenses come down, right? Once they realize what it's like themselves to feel heard versus what it's not once you put them at the center of the story, right? Like the doctor's ego at the center of the story, where they haven't felt heard because they've been patients too, versus when they feel like they're in a collaborative situation where they have a say in their outcome. They understand pretty quickly why it's important once you just put them in the shoes of what it's like and slow them down. They get it pretty quickly. Yeah.
That actually kind of leads into the next thing I was curious about, which is, so if someone is trying to apply this sort of process, like what's a good first step they can take to start getting past some of these objections people have? Like you said, put people in the shoes of the patient. So what's kind of your suggestion for people that think maybe I should try this out, or it could be a way for me to help with my team? What's kind of like the first steps they can take to start seeing some of these results and help get people on board?
Yeah, I think the first thing is always to listen. I think everything starts with listening. So I think if you can do some listening exercises first with the group, and then you build in the yes and. So what are some things you can do to help the group be present, more actively listening, and then build from there the culture of what do we do to validate and build off one another collaboratively. And I think if you can't listen, then you can't really do anything else, right? You can't connect. So otherwise, it's all about you, and you're in here and not out there. So I think those are the fundamentals.
And so you said listening exercises. Is there a particular listening exercise that's your favorite, or is one that's worked really well in the past?
I really love an exercise called last letter conversation. So that's one where if you get into pairs, and so let's say you and I were playing, so we would be having a conversation about the week we're having, and the very last letter of what I say would be the first letter of your response.
Ooh.
Yeah. So if I said, Karl, I heard you're going to be releasing 30 podcasts in the next few weeks, you would need to use the S to respond back to me.
That's really fun, because it gamifies learning how to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that's when Reggie said the last letter game, I immediately had a sense of what it was, and it definitely, I can see how the whole improv thing works into it now, because it's such a great way to, especially if you're doing this with a group, to get people, oh my gosh, this is another like team building exercise. Okay, it's actually kind of fun. I have to, and you're gonna gamifying it makes it. There's a little bit of like a challenge and a little bit of competitiveness,
Mm-hmm.
but it still builds the skills that that people need to learn how to do, like to listen effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously it works with like teams, with one-on-one. I
Mm-hmm.
imagine there's like, it seems like that similar sort of thing to what the Together to Gather game is like. It's
Mm-hmm.
where but that works with a group, right? I'd love to hear,
Yeah.
I think, hear more about that game, because I have a sense of what it is, but I'd love to delve into it more, because actually my first guest on the show, Leah James, told me about it after we finished recording.
Oh,
And so I was like, oh my gosh, that's such a cool game. Why didn't you mention it on the show? So I'd love to hear about that, because I think it takes that whole gamifying human connection to a whole nother level. So please tell me more about Together to Gather.
Sure. So Leah and I co-created a card deck, and it's a 2-part card deck. The first part are story prompts, because we really felt like people can make deep connections through story, right? And that We walk by people every day, and yet somehow we don't really see them or get to know them on a deep level. And the second part of the deck is because we don't necessarily know how to ask curious questions. And so that second part of the deck is a bunch of prompts to help you go deeper into the story. And so with the first part of the deck, you are picking out a prompt that you can relate to and tell a story with a partner. And the second part of the deck, you get to choose as the storyteller from your partner's 3 to 5 different curious questions. And so you as the storyteller have agency to pick which one of your partner's curious questions you would like to choose to go deeper and which way you want to go deeper. So it might be like, what happened before that part of the story, or what were the feelings that you had when you experienced that. And it's teaching you how to not stay on the surface, but really how to build a deeper connection with the person that you have become connected to. And so we've seen that this has really been helpful for a lot of people. Some people don't necessarily have the tools to know how to go deeper. Some people forget. There's all different things. They just need a structure or a game or a framework to do that. And so that was why the card deck was birthed from Leah and I.
Yeah, I when she was telling me about it, she talked about how you use it at events where you can have one person with a group, and it almost becomes like a game of apples to apples, where people they tell a story and they get like a bunch of questions, and you pick the one you want from the group, and it's again gamifying, building these skills of human connection and how to, like you said, go deeper with questions and follow up. And I think it's such a genius idea that, especially for events where people so often don't get past that surface level, like, oh, where you're from, what do you do,
exactly
stuff that
it's
you
so
get like their
level.
card and you don't really know who you talk to or why you should follow up. But if you have a deeper discussion, people tell more stories, then it leads to much stronger connections, and then actual relationships can come from it, and not just a giant collection of business cards you have to purge at the end of the year.
Exactly. And that's what we've seen. We've seen at many events that we've done around the country. We've seen people become friends. We've seen people that didn't know each other 2 hours before the event leave and go to lunch together. And we've had people stop us at the end of our thing and say, well, how do we connect with everybody after this event? Like, how are we going to keep going? And when's the next thing? Because they connected in a deep way. So it's been really wonderful to see how much story and curiosity really help with human connection, help with the epidemic of loneliness that a lot of people around the world are dealing with. And game and story really help with those things. They help break down barriers and walls. And same thing with the improv piece. It doesn't have to be intimidating. It doesn't have to be you're acting like a crazy person up on stage. There are just so many fundamentally wonderful tenets that come out of story, that come out of improv, that are about bringing everybody's voice and listening and being present and playing off one another, that are just so useful in being better humans, right? And just showing up in a much kinder way.
Yeah, it's something that it's so like human storytelling and human connection are so fundamental to who we are and what makes us human, that people don't realize there's still skills you have to develop, and if you don't use them, they will atrophy like any sort of muscle. And so people let it atrophy, or they don't, and they especially with the pandemic, when people being physically separated for health reasons, like that made things even worse. And so it's there's actually like a story of there's a guy who, when the whole Y2K thing was going off, he drove his car up into like the north, some park in the north of New York, and just like walked into the wilderness and just lived up there for like 15 years alone because they thought society was going to collapse. And then they caught him stealing from campgrounds and stuff after like 15 years of living alone with no human contact. And when they stuck him in like the prison, he promptly freaked out because he had no social skills anymore.
Wow.
And so obviously that's an extreme case, but it still shows that like social skills and communication and storytelling, even though they're core to what brings us joy and makes us human, you still have to work on it.
You
And
do.
so rebuilding those skills a game and making it fun and not a chore, I think is a brilliant solution to the loneliness and disconnection problems that are facing the world, because it is something that you can't just idly rest on and expect to excel at like any skill.
Absolutely. I used to, when I was performing in an improv troupe on a regular basis, and I would be there every week, right? And then I would go on vacation, I would come back and I would realize that muscle in my brain had weakened from being gone even a week. And I would say to people, it's just like going to the gym, right? And so if you go to the gym every week and then you take off a week for vacation, you're in pain. It hurts to like walk up the stairs and get to the gym. And it's because, again, like you have to use that muscle like you were talking about. And if you don't practice, it shows. And we're expected in a lot of ways in our working world to be good at listening, to be collaborative, to be innovative, to tell stories and present. And yet we don't practice it enough. So, and it's a muscle that you have to go to the gym, like a different kind of gym, but still, it takes practice.
Yep, absolutely. So, well, thank you so much for connecting with me today, Jessie. If you enjoyed this episode of the Human Connection podcast, please leave a review, and share it. If you'd like to connect with myself or Jessie, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.
Bye.